Leading stories, trending topics, changing narratives. You're listening to the Critical Conversations Podcast.
Welcome back to the Critical Conversations Podcast, everyone. My name is Dr. Rick Daniels, and I am the Director of Institutional Equity and Inclusion right here at Oakton College. In this episode, we'll be exploring the recent executive orders signed by the presidential administration and discuss their impacts on higher education, and in particular, here at Oakton. These policy changes have broad implications, and it's essential that we take the time to reflect, analyze, and discuss how they affect our students, faculty, and staff. Today, we're joined by Associate Professor of Political Science, Keith Simonds, who will help us to break down these executive actions and what they mean for our campus community. Keith, welcome. How are you today?
Thanks very much for having me. I'm doing quite well.
Excellent, excellent. Let's start off with a little bit of about me. Tell me a little bit about yourself. How long have you been at Oakton? What got you into teaching political science, and how you became interested in this as a career path?
I've been teaching at Oakton full-time for just over a year. I worked as an adjunct here for a couple of years prior to that. I actually was an Oakton student many years ago, and that was actually really important to me getting interested in political science. After I transferred to UIC, after attending Oakton, graduated, and actually went to work in politics. After having done that for a while, decided to go back to school to study politics from an academic perspective. But politics has always been very important to my way of trying to understand the world. I think it offers a really helpful lens in making sense of things, even though it often confuses before it enlightens. But it's a really important way of trying to understand the way we all interact with each other.
Tell me a little bit about the work you did in politics.
So I primarily worked on campaigns. I worked for the 2008 Obama presidential campaign. I worked in Ohio. One of the things I really liked about that work is you got to travel a lot. You got to meet people in all kinds of different communities from your own. I worked in Missouri. I worked in a bunch of Chicago races. But the thing I didn't like is that it's a very hectic lifestyle because you're go, go, go until election day. Then you're very quickly unemployed. Need to figure out what you're going to do next. So it's a very fun, exciting way to do things, but also gets exhausting after a while.
Yeah, I would imagine. That's funny. I never thought of that. Once the campaign wraps up, we take the results and then we just move on with our lives. But people who work, now have to look for job opportunities. I never thought of it that way.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means if you're on the winning side, maybe you get a job in the government they're forming. If you've lost, maybe you're going to another state to find another race to hop onto.
Yeah. So you did a presentation yesterday for our in-person session that was just phenomenal. And I wanted us to have a conversation today for our listeners who weren't able to be there. As of February 4th, 2025, President Donald Trump has signed 45 executive orders since his inauguration on January 20th. These orders have a range of policy areas and implications. And so I was hoping today that you could give us just an overview of what an executive order is, some historical context, and then we'll shift into a conversation about how that impacts the institution. But for those who don't know, and I'm asking this because an executive order is not bound or attached to one president.
Right.
But I feel like the narrative around it is starting to change a bit. For those who don't know, what is an executive order?
Right. So part of the confusion also stems from the fact that were I to pull up a PDF of the Constitution right now and, do a Control F search, I would not find executive orders described. An executive order at its most basic is just the office of the president trying to direct the federal government to do something. So this can be extraordinarily basic. George Washington, who issued the first executive order, basically wanted his departments to report back to him about their readiness for various things. This is sort of the most basic use of executive power. If we go back to our sort of, 101 civics, Congress writes the laws, and then the president is supposed to execute them. And part of how they might do that is by using executive orders to direct the government to take certain actions. Part of what gets confusing is it does not always have the force of law, but sometimes it does. In order for it to have the force of law, it needs to either come very directly from the powers given to the president in the Constitution, Article 2, that deals with presidential power, or it has to be something where Congress has either expressed or implied that the president has been delegated some sort of power. And so if we think of some of the famous historical examples, I was reading a little bit more about this one today just because a student had asked, when we desegregated the armed forces, Truman did that through an executive order. Now,
Wow.
it was a big thing to do, and it actually took several years for that process to play out. But essentially, because of the role of commander-in-chief and the control the president has over the military, he was able to do that without needing congressional action because so much power is given to the president. But that's, again, specifically because we're talking about an extension of the executive branch authority that is very, very clear. And so we have lots of examples like that are fairly straightforward, very consequential, but still we're talking about an actual narrow use of power.
Can you give us some examples of executive orders other executive orders that have impacted history and, where we are today?
Sure. Some of the most famous ones that had enormous consequence, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which of course began the process of ending slavery in the United States, was issued as an executive order. And it's a good example in part because, of course, huge consequence of what you're talking about, the president trying to do there. But it also does not get finished as a process until we actually amend the Constitution and the 13th Amendment, which ends the practice of slavery. And that's an example where the president got that ball rolling, which is one good way to think about executive orders is its attempt to get something started. So one failed example I often give to students is when Barack Obama was president, he issued an order to begin the process of closing the Guantanamo Bay prison that we still have. That process did not end with the closing of Guantanamo Bay. Congress was opposed to it. They didn't want to give any funds for that process, and so Obama was not successful in using that. We also have orders that have been historically come to be viewed very negatively. Perhaps the most infamous example is when President Roosevelt issued an order that led to the internments of Japanese Americans and Japanese citizens living in the United States in response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the supposed idea that Japanese in the United States would represent a national security threat. This has both been undone by a future executive order by President Gerald Ford, and the Supreme Court has essentially sort of apologized for their past approval of this process. But one of the things, and it's also important to understand, is executive orders live and die by the president in the sense that any executive order that a president puts forth can simply be repealed by the next president.
Yeah,
and
do we see that? Is that something that's common? Meaning in every presidential administration, is it common for them to come in and make an executive order to undo what the previous president did? And if so, how long has it been that way?
Right. So that's a great question. And the short answer is it's become very, very common. So particularly the last few administrations, because we've gone from Trump to Biden to Trump. Trump got in, issued a bunch of executive orders. Biden wins in 2020. Once he's in office, in his first week, I think he repealed several dozen executive orders that Trump had put through. Then when Trump wins, of course, the most recent election, first thing he did is get rid of a bunch of Biden orders and put a bunch of his back in place. And because executive orders are this assertion of executive policy, executive authority, it's very clear that that does work. A president can always repeal a previous executive order, and it's very, very common on lots of little things. So labor issues where Republican presidents tend to be more antagonistic to organized labor. You have the famous example where George H.W. Bush put in a sort of anti-labor executive order, which was then undone by Bill Clinton, re-put into place by George W. Bush, and then revoked once again when Barack Obama became president. So it's sort of a ping pong game going back and forth. As long as you're changing parties, you're probably going to see a lot of executive orders get undone.
So is that what we saw with the travel ban?
Right, so the travel ban is a perfect example where we both had two sort of important things to learn from that example. One, the travel ban that eventually got approved by the Supreme Court, we'll come back to that, was just completely rejected by the Biden administration. So it had been in place, it was no longer in place, and it is going to be in place once again. I don't think he's actually done that yet, but I'm sure they will if they have not. But the way that process worked was also a really good example. It took the Trump administration sort of 3 bites at the apple to get that executive order approved. The first version was done very, very quickly after his inauguration. I had lots of legal challenges that were slowing it down. So rather than continue fighting that one through the courts, they simply issued a new executive order that pushed that one aside. That order also had problems in court, so they issued a third final order that eventually made its way to the Supreme Court and got approval. So in that sense, you can also see that an executive order is the beginning of a process.
Right.
Does not guarantee implementation or success at the end. In that instance, it took them 3 tries and many court cases to get it done, but they did eventually get it done. Then Biden can get rid of it, but then Trump can bring it right back once he's in office.
So the states, in their role. I think about San Francisco v. Trump, right? Tell us a little bit about the role of the states as it relates to executive orders.
Right. So one of the things that we're seeing right now is sort of playing out again, very similar to the case you mentioned, where that case had to do with this idea by the Trump administration that they would deny federal funds to cities and states that weren't agreeing with their policy towards undocumented immigrants, particularly sanctuary cities like Chicago, where Chicago does not assist immigration authorities. If Chicago police officers arrest somebody and they find out they're undocumented, they don't turn them over to ICE. Now, when the Trump's government tried to withhold funds, this went to court and they essentially lost that and said you can't withhold funds for these reasons. And this is actually one of the big fights we're seeing start right now, is this question of what happens when states have their own laws that are going to contradict these executive orders? What happens when states have their own policies that are going to conflict? And one of the things that we're going to see is places like Illinois will be trying to assert we have laws that we have to follow. And so it would be a much stronger case for the federal government if these were based on congressional action. So there were new laws on the book. But when you have executive orders and state law conflicting, that's a more complicated process.
Absolutely. And I think that so many of the promises that have been made so far are going to require congressional action. I'm interested to see how they really hold up. I want to cover a couple of other societal pieces before we get to higher ed and specifically Oakton. Tell me about TikTok. Tell me about TikTok. My kids love TikTok. I have it, but I think it's information overload. But I respect the ways in which people use it for a living, the way people use it for information and to tell stories. However, this is a little bit off topic, but I want to know, I would love to hear your opinion. Is there some merit to the claim that it's a national security risk for data? And if so, how does that feed into how this executive order plays out right now to this day?
Right. So the TikTok example is a really interesting one. I would say first, there are some legitimate concerns with really all social media companies and the way they're using data and the way they collect and share that data. And specifically with TikTok, the concern is this parent company that has this relationship with the Chinese government. And so Congress, when they were legislating on this...
Which is ByteDance, right?
ByteDance,
okay,
exactly. Yeah. And so when Congress was dealing with this, they were really concentrated on this question of this national security threat that they perceived because of China's involvement. And some of this, I think, is overblown in terms of they're going to, indoctrinate the youth of the United States by adjusting the algorithm to a certain thing. I know friends and family who use TikTok who, if the Chinese government is trying to get, for example, my brother to watch the video he's doing, I have no idea what their intention is because he's just having a fun time on TikTok. But when Congress passed this legislation, the interesting thing was Trump had actually been trying to ban TikTok when he was president, actually through executive order, failed for a variety of reasons. And then when Congress passed this, we were in this very interesting thing because it was right at the end of the Biden administration. And essentially the Biden administration said they weren't going to enforce this law. They would let it sort of just exist as is until Trump came into office. And then Trump issued an executive order saying that we're not going to enforce this, that the companies don't need to worry about any liability associated with hosting TikTok on their servers. But really interestingly, some companies have now done that. But if you go to Apple or Google, their app stores, you cannot download the TikTok app right now. And the basic reason is the way the law is written is you could have billions and billions of dollars of liability. And despite the fact that the president is saying he will not carry out this law, number one, he could change his mind. He could issue another executive order or just ignore that order. And number two, the statute of limitations written into the law, as has been brought up by several senators, is 5 years. So if the next president turns around and says, I'm going to go ahead and, follow this law, you could all of a sudden see huge liability come into play.
Yeah. So right now you can't download it you can't download a new version.
Yeah, so
but if you have it, you're in.
That's basically what I understand. And also it's so Google Play Store and the Apple Store will not let you download it right now because they're worried about this. There are other ways to access it that are fine, but the companies are playing sort of a risky game because it depends on hoping things are going to stay the way they are now. And I think that Google and Apple, just because of their size, are just looking at the dollar signs associated with that risk and deciding it's not worth it right now.
Okay. Can I shift to tariffs? Tell me a little bit about where we are with that.
Right. So this is one of those great examples where things are moving very quickly. So the president issued tariffs against China, Mexico, and Canada. In the case of both Canada and Mexico, we seem to have reached a pause on those tariffs after agreements were made with both countries, the details of which are slightly confusing because both sides are sort of claiming they won. In the case of China, we now have tariffs going into place that are going to place, I believe, a 10% tariff on most Chinese imports. China's responding in kind with a 15% hike on American products. And essentially, this is happening for a number of reasons. If you look at the language of the executive order, Trump is connecting this very directly to concerns both about drugs coming in from outside the United States, particularly fentanyl. He's connecting it to undocumented immigration. And in those cases, he's using authority that is really one of these examples where Congress has delegated this power. They've given presidents a lot of flexibility with things like tariffs, particularly if it's for an emergency, as Trump is alleging it is, in terms of drugs and immigration. And so by doing that, he is asserting this ability to engage in what he sees as protection of the United States national security, using these tariffs as a way to get policy concessions from those countries.
I think that from an executive order standpoint, just so the people are aware, is that something that an executive order, that the president can do through executive order, raise tariffs?
Yes. And so
that
this
doesn't have to be a congressional action. Yes.
Right. So yes, the president absolutely can do this. They could still be challenged. So one of the examples of the way it might be challenged is Trump in the orders. And one thing I can recommend everyone to do, if you ever have questions about a particular executive order, go look at the text. And one of the reasons for that is they're going to both obviously lay out what they're doing, but also talk about why they're doing it and what authority they're pointing to. And in the case of the tariffs, they're really stressing this national security concern. But then when Trump talks about it publicly, he has, for example, said that one of the ways Canada could avoid suffering from the fate of tariffs would be to become the, quote, 51st state of the United States. And then he says, because I don't like having a trade deficit with them. If I were one of the companies being harmed by these tariffs, which many auto manufacturers and others have very quick cases to make, I would say, well, he's arguing the authority that he's using comes from fentanyl. Very, very little fentanyl actually comes through the Canadian border. And instead, this seems to be about a trade imbalance. So therefore, they might be able to try to challenge the authority the president is using in this instance.
Yeah.
But generally, tariffs, presidents do have this power. Again, Congress could step in and try to, impose their own tariffs or change the dynamic there. But this is one of the areas where Congress has really given a lot of power to the president over time.
Let's talk about another national security concern, DEI. This has become quite the topic over the last couple of weeks. And I really want to know from you, what does the executive order say? What power and authority does it have? And what are the real implications for people who are in the profession, as well as people who are, maybe newcomers to the idea and the thought process around it?
Right. So this is one of the areas where you're exactly right that we've seen really aggressive use of the executive orders. And there's sort of two big buckets that are worth considering differently. When the president is, for example, as he has in these orders, directing federal government agencies to cease their DEI programs, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in some cases, that he clearly has the authority to do. Part of that is because a lot of the DEI programs that exist at the federal level came from an executive order that Joe Biden put through. So what lives by executive order dies by executive order in that case. But that really is going to be most true, again, in federal agencies. So the Department of Defense is making very quick changes, removing DEI positions, that sort of thing. Where it gets a lot more complicated is it also directs different federal agencies to issue guidance to other institutions that are receiving federal funds of various kinds, and says that they want to make sure that the way they interpret civil rights law is not being violated by following DEI practices that they say are discriminatory. And so they're sort of using civil rights law to say that the way, again, they interpret these two different categories of DEI policies and civil rights law as being in contradiction with one another. But this is one of those, and this is often going to be the case in a lot of these orders. Basically, it is telling members of his administration to come up with a plan. So in this case, they're supposed to issue guidance through the Attorney General for how different institutions, including colleges and universities, are supposed to respond to these policy changes. So we don't know what that looks like yet.
Yeah.
But we do know that this administration is very hostile to these programs and is trying to make a case for eroding them both in public and private sector roles. One of the most aggressive things we've seen is some states' attorneys general are actually going after companies like Costco and suggesting that they want them to explain why they're not getting rid of their DEI policies. And that's an area where Costco's on firm ground doing what they want to do. But in terms of federal grants and federal money flowing into other institutions, that's where it's going to get a lot more difficult.
So they can make Costco, they can ask the question,
right?
But they don't have the power to withhold in the way that we've seen them do that before, seen them do that up until now. DEI, as we know, is a way of life. I think it's more about humanity. And I think what I also see is that we're at a point where the executive order is bringing it to the attention of people who maybe never had to think about it in the first place, which can actually backfire, as we know. I'm interested to see how Congress reacts and what that means down the line. As we shift into some of the ones that particularly impact Oakton, I want to take a pause here and talk in a very intentional way about immigration. Because we've kind of intentionally sped a little bit through the other ones, but we know that this one has far-reaching implications. Now, for our listeners out there, we're not able to answer any questions right now as it relates to responding to immigrations and customs enforcement, also known as ICE. But stay tuned because we do have an episode coming up with our chief of police to talk specifically about that. Today here with Professor Keith, I want to just ask if you give us a broad stroke about what that executive order states and maybe perhaps what your predictions are for how that may hold up in the courts over the next couple of years.
Yeah, so the immigration area is one where the president has been very aggressive as well. It's also an area where presidents do have a lot of authority. So, for example, the travel ban, which we already talked a bit about, one of the reasons that eventually succeeded in the courts is because the president could point to a lot of congressional action, including the Immigration Naturalization Act, which really gave a lot of discretion to the presidency. We can even think of examples under the Obama administration, and the DACA program really was an executive action. That was a little more complicated than the executive order, but it relied on executive power. So one of the things we're seeing the Trump administration trying to do is use this declaration of an invasion at the southern border, which he did through executive order, to allow him to really speed up the process by which people are removed from the United States. One of the things, according to U.S. law, for example, is anyone who comes to the United States and gets to American soil who is trying to seek asylum is supposed to get a hearing. And under this emergency declaration, they're attempting to not have to hold those hearings so they can go faster. And part of this is an argument that people have been abusing this law, but the law is certainly still on the books. And then they're also trying to do things that include perhaps one of the most controversial, and the one that we have very little detail on, is a requirement they're trying to put forth that all undocumented migrants would have to register with the federal government. And in going to register, again, we don't know how this would work. The details have not been released. But if you avoid doing this, they would then add new criminal penalties on top of what they consider your illegal presence in the United States. So this could be a fine. This could be any number of things. We've had very dramatic orders, including supposedly today, the first planes are leaving, holding undocumented immigrants to be housed in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, in order to use that as a staging ground before deportation. But a lot of what we're going to see very quickly is this attempt to simply ramp up the number of migrants that are being deported, which is actually a very complicated thing to do in terms of just not having the infrastructure. So, for example, their numbers right now are actually lower than they've been at a lot of other presidencies without that focus. And part of that is just because it is a practical and expensive thing to do. And we're already seeing challenges to a lot of the legality of these questions. One of the perhaps biggest ones that I think is most clearly going to run into problems in the courts is this argument about birthright citizenship,
right? That
they would categorize anyone not born to parents who are both citizens would not be granted citizenship. This is controversial, not just because it changes longstanding policy, but because this is pretty clearly in contrast to the clear language of the 14th Amendment, which again is a post-Civil War amendment that was trying to prevent formerly enslaved people from being denied citizenship.
Right.
And part of how they did that is just say, you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. So these are all going to be used by the Trump administration to attempt to speed this process up. But again, every step of the way, we're going to see states, localities that have very different policies on this, both opposing that. But like as J.B. Pritzker, our governor, has talked about, they can't prevent ICE from coming into the state of Illinois or anything like that. But they are doing everything they can to make sure that immigrants know that they still have rights associated with the Constitution, and that they can use those rights to make sure that the process is followed correctly, and that they're going to do everything they can to make sure that we continue doing things the way we want to in the state of Illinois.
Thank you for touching on that. What other executive orders do you think have a unique impact to Oakton, or are there any others?
Well, we talked about DEI generally, but a lot of the DEI stuff they're doing is specific to colleges. And part of the way they're doing that is, again, by looking at federal funding, federal grants, and trying to use those as a way to both end policies they don't like or discourage policies they don't like. So we are seeing investigations headed up by the Attorney General into, they're supposed to look at schools with endowments over $1 billion, which does not cover most schools, but sort of as a first step.
Yeah.
And so
start at the top.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so we're very likely to see that expand over time. But what exactly it means, again, is going to be difficult, because schools that operate in states that have clear state law that includes DEI language, who have very clear policies on civil rights law in those states, are not in a position to just disregard those laws all of a sudden. And so schools are going to be looking both to their state leaders and representatives to help them guide through that process. But it's one of those things where the executive orders are also sort of designed to change the narrative and the way people think about these things. But as I've said, it really is this beginning of a process. So in most of these instances, we're going to see sort of details roll out in the next weeks, months, that will make clearer what they're going to do. But they'll also, during that time, of course, have these core challenges and other things that are going to make that even more complicated. So we'll certainly see impacts on institutions like Oakton. What precisely they will be, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Wow. That, like my listeners, I'm sure my head is spinning because I think a part of the strategy is to flood, to send a flood of information to cause confusion. There was a term for that someone said.
Flood the zone is
flood
one of
the zone.
Yes,
yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. And I think that is definitely having an impact on how this is received. One last thing that I would ask from you is, what are some final takeaways or points of information that listeners can know that can help them to process through this as more come down? There were a few more that were signed, I think, either yesterday or a couple of days ago, and I'm sure they're going to keep coming. What are some key takeaways or strategies for listeners to be able to wrap their minds around this as we move forward?
Right. That's a great question. One of the things I really strongly suggest is, and this is something we all fall prey to sometimes, is don't let the headlines be the only thing you're reacting to when you see.
Wait a minute. Can you say that again? Say it for the people in the back. Don't
let the headlines be the only thing you react to.
Don't let the headlines be the only thing that you react to. We live in such a headline-driven society that's impactful. I'm sorry. I caught the witness on that one. Go ahead.
And one of the reasons I think that's so important is even media institutions that are trying to do a good job are sometimes really dropping the ball on explaining how this actually works. So just today, I saw the announcement that Trump had signed an executive order to create a sovereign wealth fund for the United States. Now, I don't know what that's going to look like, and neither does the federal government. In the announcement, if you look at the order, there's almost no detail. It, again, really just asks part of the federal government to start looking at how that process would look. How would that roll out? How might it be funded? Because one of the big problems with the idea is, of course, the United States federal government is in debt and runs a deficit. So where's the money coming from? You put into the fund.
Right.
These are all things we don't know. So make sure you read the entire article, not just the headline, but then also I strongly recommend looking at the executive orders themselves. They are often going to be slightly confusing if you're not used to reading that kind of language, but some of them are very simple to read. And again, the likelihood that an order is going to, quote, work and actually have its sort of intended function, is it talking about specific authority of the president or congressional statutes that give them that authority, or is it kind of just winging it? Is it using very general kind of claims?
Yeah.
Then I'm going to be...
Good point.
Yeah.
Because some of them have more specific language and others don't.
Right.
Yeah.
If it's just my authority as president and they don't have any follow-up after that, then I'm going to be less confident that's going to work in the long run. But finding, I think, one really great blog that's been doing a good job on this is the Lawfare website. Has a lot of good both podcasts and write-ups going at these orders sort of one by one, where lawyers are talking about them. Because again,
Lawfare.
Okay. Because implementation is the problem. Like, I can issue an order tomorrow as president, and it might not be implemented fully for years. And by the time I got it halfway implemented, I may have lost an election that never gets implemented.
Yeah.
So just really looking at the details. When you're not sure, there are lots of resources that are available. Your state, in this case, Illinois, the Illinois Attorney General has been talking about things like, does the Department of Education in Illinois need to make changes to policy? And they're saying, no, not right now. There's no reason we need to change anything. They're pushing back against what they see as federal overreach in certain instances. So look to local and state figures for guidance as well. And just, again, really pay attention to the details. Don't let the, flashiest version of what you hear be the one you help spread to everyone else.
Yeah. Good one. Thank you. This has been a thorough analysis, and I appreciate your willingness and your ability to break this down into manageable chunks. I hope the listeners were able to grab onto something. Even if there are listeners who already knew this information, I'm hoping they learned something new. Thank you for joining us today. I do want to do a personal question, an opinion question on the outtake. Okay. This may or may not make the show. If you don't want it to be on the show, that's fine.
Sure.
Do you think that we're really going to end up with a third term? Do you think that the Congress will act on that? I can see an executive order that maybe tries to support that, but do you actually believe, just again, personal opinion, that Congress will vote to change, and ultimately, because that would have to be what, the 26th amendment?
That's the 22nd amendment that deals with this. But so this came up in a class a couple of years ago, so I did a little research into a version of this question. I think that there's only one place where there's any doubt. Amending the Constitution is just so extraordinarily difficult that anything that really requires that is not going to happen. There is this sort of way of reading the 22nd Amendment, and there's law review articles written about this, where you cannot be elected president again. You have a limit. But there's this idea that what if, for example, you have Barack Obama, who served twice as president, were he to run as vice president and somebody else ran as president, could that person then resign and then Obama would be president? Yeah. And there's some people...
I thought about that once, too.
So there's some people who think that works. I don't. I think it's just something that the Supreme Court would knock down as being too fast and loose with the facts. But it's a really clear thing in the Constitution, because part of what the courts would do is look at what's the clear intention here.
Right.
And, the Constitution is not supposed to be thought of as, a document with lots of cute loopholes we can find. That it's supposed to be fairly clear and understandable.
Yeah.
So I don't worry about that. I also, in Trump's particular instance, I think he'll get aged out of that question because he is, I think, 78 years old?
78
at the moment.
Yeah.
So I think that question may be dealt with through that. But I do think it's also, concerning whenever a president starts joking, as he kind of does about it. It's something that people should take somewhat seriously, because when it's in the Constitution, it should be something that the president takes seriously too.
Keith Simonds, Associate Professor for Political Science, and a brilliant person to talk to about this. Keith, thank you for joining us today. How can the people reach you? Do you have an Instagram, an email? Give us something that folks can follow up with you.
Well, my pleasure for being here. Thanks for having me. I really am not. I'm one of the people not on social media, but I'm always reachable at Oakton, at ksimonds@oakton.edu. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to talk about any political issues that are coming up.
Professor Simonds, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
The Critical Conversations podcast is recorded at Oakton College, located at 1600 East Gulf Road, Des Plaines, Illinois. The show is sponsored in part by the Oakton College Educational Foundation, produced by Erick, Rohn, coordinated by Brenda, Cruz, and hosted by Dr. Rick Daniels. For more information or to connect with us, email critsconpod@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for more Critical Conversations.